programmes, we've been looking at the myth that science and faith are in conflict with each other. Nicholas Copernicus was the man who put forward the idea that the Earth goes round the sun. People often claim that he was persecuted by the Christian Church, but we've seen that this isn't true. He lived and died as a practicing Christian. People sometimes say that Copernicus delayed publishing his theory because he was afraid of being persecuted. This isn't true either. The fact is that he put off publishing his book not because he was afraid of persecution, but because he knew that the scientific evidence for it wasn't very convincing. In the years after Copernicus, astronomers like Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler weren't persecuted either. In fact, Kepler claimed that he was thinking God's thoughts after him. People often talk about the trial of Galileo as the great example of the church persecuting a scientist. But we've seen that there were personality conflicts and political issues in play here that had nothing to do with any conflict between science and faith. And again, one of the issues in Galileo's day was that the scientific evidence for his theory just wasn't that strong. Galileo wasn't put to death, he wasn't tortured, he wasn't put in prison. He was found guilty and put under house arrest, but he was allowed to carry on with his scientific work. In the generations after Galileo, we saw that scientists like Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle didn't find any conflict between their scientific discoveries and their religious beliefs. In the 19th century, Darwin's theory of evolution certainly did lead to some conflict. But even here, people often picture it in a way that's oversimplified or even dishonest. As with Copernicus and Galileo, when Darwin first published his theory, the scientific evidence for it wasn't that strong. Many people disagreed with him on scientific grounds, not religious grounds. People often describe the great debate between Thomas Huxley and Samuel Wilberforce in Oxford in 1860 as a turning point in the conflict. But when you look more closely, you find that nothing happened the way it's described today. There wasn't a formal debate. Most of the people there couldn't even hear what Huxley said, and both sides went away thinking they'd won the exchange. It was only years later that Huxley and his followers started to spin the story into the one that we hear today. At about the same time as the great debate in Oxford, one of the world's leading physics labs was being set up here in Cambridge. 19th century physicists like Lord Kelvin and James Clerk Maxwell didn't see any conflict between their science and their faith. In fact, Maxwell had a verse from the Bible carved onto the door of his new laboratory. Another famous episode in the supposed conflict was the Scopes monkey trial here in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. John Scopes was put on trial for teaching evolution to his high school class and breaking a state law. But once again, the way the story is told is nothing like what actually happened. Something that started out as a publicity stunt by the businessman in a small town became a viral news story and a violent conflict when the national media got hold of it. Scopes was found guilty, but he wasn't put in prison and he didn't lose his job. The prosecutor, William Jennings Bryan, wasn't an ignorant, Bible-thumping fundamentalist. He was a liberal, a Democratic candidate for president, and a former Secretary of State. Time and again, the way people tell these stories today has been spun as a story of science and faith in conflict. But the people who were there at the time wouldn't have recognized this story. Sometimes people tell these stories in genuine ignorance because they haven't bothered to find out the facts. But sometimes they tell these stories in a deliberately dishonest way. They do know better, but they have an agenda. They're telling these stories in bad faith.